I've been set the slightly tall order of setting the political scene. I'm very mindful in my nautier moments that there are some islands in the Indian Ocean called the Andaman Islands, which are off the coast of India, and they're inhabited by a group of people who have been incapable of being approached by any outside peoples at any stage in the last 2,000 years. If you approach the islands, they will come down onto the foreshore and fire arrows at you. They will spear people who try to land, and in fact, I think we can probably say that they are a group of people on planet Earth who appear to be in total control of their lives. The fact that they're still living in a Stone Age condition is presumably a matter of personal choice for them. And of course, there is also the rather curious aspect to the fact that the only reason why they're able to do this is because, in fact, the islands belong to India, and the Indian government, for reasons of their own, have decided to give them a sort of protective zone. If the protective zone were ever to be removed, then I fear that these very interesting people would find themselves obliterated very quickly. But nevertheless, for the moment, they have kept and taken back control. And I do sometimes think about this when I contemplate the debate which is currently taking place in Parliament on control. Because obviously the issues surrounding the post-Brexit relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU are all about the extent to which we wish to take back control or share control with others. And one of the consequences of this, and let's absolutely face up to it because this is an audience where we're going to be honest with each other, is that the disagreement over what taking back control actually means is in quite serious danger of ripping the Conservative Party to shreds. So that far from, as some of my colleagues predicted to me just before the referendum, when they said, oh, it'll be so much better if the referendum votes leave because it'll all be so much easier to come together afterwards. I have to say that I thought that was an astonishingly optimistic assertion, because if we voted to remain, we were voting to retain the status quo, and keeping a status quo is always easier than navigating the channels of what, in fact, we did on the 23rd of June as a UK electorate, which is to precipitate a revolution that we have then handed to a Conservative Prime Minister to implement, which is in itself something of a contradiction in terms. And so from that, I have to say to you, stems most of the political problems that we are now facing. Of course, in the context of the House of Commons, it's abundantly clear that there is an overwhelming majority of MPs, as we saw with the triggering of Article 50, who accept the principle that we are going to be leaving the EU. The only minority that doesn't do it is the Liberal Democrats, and they have been virtually written out of the script completely at the moment as a political force. Labour do not have a coherent position at all on what our future relationship with the EU should be, but apart from a group of about 40 to 60 Labour MPs who show some pretty clear signs of being willing to try to reverse the referendum verdict if they could find a way of doing it, actually the rest of the Labour Party, because of their experience in their constituencies, particularly outside of London, wish to carry through Brexit. And on the Conservative benches, despite the fact I have been described as a bespectacled Che Guevara and a rebel commander, if I may say, and I'll come on to this in a moment, the extent of my rebellion has, I think, really, by my standards, been fairly modest. Creatively, I could think of lots of other things I might do if I wanted to obstruct the Brexit process, but it's never been my intention to try to do that, nor that of my group of colleagues with whom I work most closely. Where then have we got ourselves? Well, we succeeded, after a great deal of effort, in getting a withdrawal agreement with the EU back in December. I think, actually, it's probably sorted out the issues around citizenship, although there's a new matter creeping in about the status of EU nationals who come in during the transition period. I'll come back to that in a moment. I think we've sorted out the money. People may not be happy about the money, but on the whole, the money doesn't really matter all that much unless you are a reader of the Daily Mail. Finally, and much more controversially, we have fudged the issue of the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Something which is at the moment haunting us, and I have to say to you, I think is going to come back and haunt us an awful lot more before this process is over. The agreement that we entered into was that in the absence of finding some other way of regulating our relationship, we would enjoy such regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and the Republic as is necessary to prevent there being any form of border. Now, I have to say to you, my personal view is that that is impossible without our staying in a customs union with the EU. And as it's completely out of the question, because we are a unionist party and a unionist parliament, that we should tolerate the idea that Northern Ireland should be in a separate customs arrangement with the EU. That customs arrangement has got to apply to the rest of the United Kingdom, and if it applies to our relationship with the Irish Republic, it must follow that it also applies to our relationship with the EU as a totality. But if that's the case, it is not at all clear to me what my good friend and colleague Liam Fox is actually doing is a job, because he may wish to go around and have as many trade deals as he can secure, and I'm very much in favour of them and delighted we're doing £9 billion worth of business with China. But the fact is that the bottom line is that we will not be able to have separate tariff arrangements, or we are going to renege on the fudged deal in December, which is going to be translated into a concrete treaty deal before the summer, in which case it looks to me as if we must be heading for a hard Brexit and indeed for WTO relations, because that aspect of the treaty which we're trying to create will have broken down. We also, I think, have probably just about agreed what transition means. A period of 2 years of vassalage, which is, in a sense, I'm in complete agreement with Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris in their characterisation of what the transition will mean. Of course, a short period of vassalage followed by total control, taking back control and total freedom, may be a price worth paying. But as some of you will have noticed, there are some at Westminster who fear that the vassalage may become more prolonged, and therefore they're increasingly restless about this issue, but they haven't yet come up with a credible alternative, because logically I think it's abundantly clear that we cannot negotiate the final deal that we want for the deep and special relationship with the EU within the time frame of the 29th of March 2019. Linked to that, we've had the withdrawal bill going through Parliament. As I keep on trying to explain to people, the withdrawal bill is not about withdrawing from the EU. It is a constitutional bill which actually concerns the workings of the UK Constitution and our legal system after we have gone, with one exception, which I shall come back to in a second. So when you listen to some of the debates that have been taking place around the EU withdrawal bill, it's abundantly clear that the people talking in Parliament haven't actually been talking about the subject matter of the legislation at all. They've been talking about the principles surrounding Brexit and our long-term relationship with our EU partners. That's not what the bill is about. But that said, the bill is of great importance. It is a constitutional measure. It's had to be taken on the floor of the House of Commons. It will have the most profound influence over the future shaping of our laws after we've gone than any other bill in modern British history. And of course, it confers extraordinary powers on government to change the law of the land, virtually every single law in this country, with one or two protected exceptions, by statutory instrument without the normal parliamentary process. And that is essentially what we were debating for those rather long 4 months in the Commons, and what led to, at the moment, the only occasion on which the government has been defeated on the passage of primary legislation, namely on Clause 9 of the bill. Now, just to explain, Clause 9 was the one bit of the bill which does concern how we withdraw from the EU, because it provided a power by which the government could change any law in the land for the purpose of implementing a withdrawal agreement that we currently do not know what it is. And as you'll also be aware, the government made clear, and I believe them with complete sincerity about this, that prior to our leaving, there will have to be firstly a meaningful vote on any final deal. Again, I shall come back to that in just a moment. But in addition to that, there has also got to be a statute implementing the terms of the withdrawal agreement. That's likely to be a bill that we have at the end of this year. So the objection I had, and the 11 mutineers had to this bill, was that this bill gave the government power to do something by statutory instrument to implement an agreement that we do not yet have and have not yet approved. And as a matter of constitutional propriety, I refuse to give any government of any complexion such a power. And that's why we voted against it. And the government lost by 4 votes. We tried to compromise, but the government, for reasons of its own, didn't want to. I think because they thought they would probably defeat the rebellion, and they miscalculated. It was unfortunate because I tried to avoid having a vote. But we didn't get there, and we've had the vote, and essentially Clause 9 is now redundant. I don't think the world's come to an end. We're still leaving the EU on the 29th of March, but it does mean that we will have to implement by statutory instrument the various measures to withdraw us from the EU after we have approved the withdrawal agreement in a vote sometime at the end of the year. The bill's now at the House of Lords. My own personal opinion is that because the bill is a constitutional measure, and because actually it doesn't undermine the fact that we're leaving the EU, I think the Lords will consider that it can have a pretty free hand at amending it however it likes. And they don't like this piece of legislation at all because of the unusual powers it gives government, and because they also say, and I think correctly, that the bill creates lots of areas of legal uncertainty. So I think it's very likely that as the bill goes through the House of Lords, it will be substantially amended. The bill will finish in the House of Lords, probably on the 2nd of May, at which stage it will come back to the House of Commons for what is called ping-pong. And that takes me back to the politics, doing the best I can in a neutral way to try to identify the issues. Firstly, sometime in the next 5 weeks, the EU is going to publish its negotiating stance in respect of the framework agreement that is so important for us and that we want to see what it is before we finally go into transition. I don't know exactly what's going to be in that, but my own opinion, having been over to Brussels, is that for the very reasons set out in Michel Barnier's rather sort of naughty document on future relationship, that it's going to be fairly starkly clear that the UK's red lines will limit us to a Canada-style agreement. Although the issue of the customs union keeps on digging into this. Secondly, we're going to have local elections in May. I don't know what your view is. It may well be that there are big variations around the country, but as the London local elections are very important, there are some signs, I'm afraid, that the Conservative position in London doesn't look very good at all for reasons which are clearly connected to Brexit, because Labour is not more popular at a national basis on 42-42 level pegging. There are still huge doubts about Jeremy Corbyn for reasons which, in my view, are absolutely correct. Then we're going to get this ping-pong. The ping-pong may well turn into more of a ping-pong about the principles of leaving the EU than about the details of the legislation. But until we actually see what happens, it's very difficult to make a prediction about that. And then, of course, we come to the crunch moment in the autumn, when the government will presumably hope to come back to Parliament with a final deal for our approval. And that is, I think, the last moment that Parliament will have to decide whether it wishes to approve the deal that the government has come up with. Now, colleagues say, the choice will be deal or no deal, leave with none. That may well be right. The alternatives, however, are clearly there for Parliament to tell the government to go back and negotiate further. But I suspect that would bring the government down, and I think one's got to factor that in, because it's a weak government with no majority, and I don't think it would survive such a rejection of what's, after all, the central pillar of its policy plank. And the other possibility, which some people float, is that we ought to have a second referendum, but that's highly controversial, and there's no point in having a second referendum unless there's some evidence that the public wish to change their mind. And I have to say to you, at the moment, the remarkable feature of the whole of this debate is how few people seem to have changed their mind. In fact, we just seem to be becoming more and more entrenched in our views. And we have to try to keep the Conservative Party together, because as I keep on pointing out to people, I may disagree with Jacob Rees-Mogg on Brexit, but I also happen to agree with Jacob on quite a few other matters. And if we fall apart, then the risk is that we will indeed hand this country over to a left-wing Labour government, particularly as I sense the public mood is increasingly restless and cynical about the ability of any politicians to deliver anything for them, which I'm afraid I also think is an inevitable consequence of the decision that was taken in 2016. So forgive me with this little tour d'horizon if I have struck a gloomy note. I have to admit I've spent most of the last 12 months trying to find reasons not to be gloomy, trying to kick myself every morning and say, be more lively, be more enthusiastic, every cloud has a silver lining and we will get through all this. And in a way, I do have it, because I'm of the view that the great British ship of state has astonishing self-righting mechanisms. But I have to say that as a sort of nightmare scenario to plunge a country with a stable democratic past into, for the sake of some great future benefits, this is not something I would have wished on anybody, but we have wished it on ourselves. And we've now got to try to make sure that we carry it out with the minimum damage and maximise the opportunities. Thank you very much.